Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dive into one of the most important naval battles in history, a battle that honestly shaped the world for 100 years. It's a story about a smaller fleet, totally outgunned, facing impossible odds, and it all came down to one commander's incredibly bold, some might even say reckless, plan.
So, how do you do it? Back in 1805, this wasn't just some thought experiment for the British Royal Navy. It was very, very real. They were up against the combined naval power of France and Spain, a force that was built to absolutely crush them. The future of their country was literally on the line.
To really get why this battle was so important, you have to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. This wasn't some random fight out at sea. No, this was a critical moment in the Napoleonic Wars, a massive conflict that had pulled in pretty much all of Europe.
Okay, so here's the deal. The French Emperor, Napoleon, had this huge army ready and waiting to cross the English Channel and invade Britain. But there was a problem. To move an army that big, he needed to control the water first. And there was just one thing standing in his way: the British fleet. So, the stage was set for this epic showdown off a place called Cape Trafalgar, right near the coast of Spain. Let's break down the two sides that were about to go head-to-head. On one side, you have the British, and they're led by the legendary Admiral Lord Nelson. On the other, you've got the bigger, combined French and Spanish fleet, under a guy named Admiral Villeneuve. And the main difference between them is pretty clear. The French and Spanish have more ships and more firepower, but the British sailors had way more experience in battle. And yeah, if you just look at the raw numbers, it does not look good for the British. The French and Spanish had 33 of these huge warships. The British, only 27. So, on paper, you'd think this was going to be an easy win for the combined fleet. But, and this is a huge but, the real advantage wasn't about the number of cannons, it was about the people firing them. The British sailors were professionals who had spent years at sea, constantly practicing. Their gunnery drills were so good they could fire their cannons 3 times in the same amount of time it took their enemies to fire just twice. In a naval battle, that kind of speed is a game changer. Admiral Nelson knew that if he fought a normal, traditional battle, lining up his ships and just trading cannon shots, he was going to lose. He had fewer ships. It was that simple. He needed something totally different, something completely unexpected. He needed a genius plan. Now, we should probably talk about what these ships actually were. Both sides were using what were called ships of the line, and you can just think of them as giant floating fortresses. There were these massive wooden warships with hundreds of sailors and decks packed with cannons. The standard way to fight was for 2 fleets to just sail in parallel lines and blast each other to pieces. But Nelson wasn't going to do that. He came up with a wild strategy he called the Nelson touch. First, he split his fleet into 2 columns. Then, instead of sailing alongside the enemy, he was going to sail straight at their line, perpendicular to it. The idea was to just punch right through their formation in 2 spots, shatter their line, and turn the whole battle into a chaotic close-range brawl where his better-trained crews would have the advantage. This was incredibly risky. His lead ships would be sailing into a wall of cannon fire for several minutes before they could even shoot back. Just before everything kicked off, Nelson had this message sent out to the entire fleet, using a system of colored flags. It was a powerful message to remind everyone what was at stake, and it went on to become one of the most famous signals in military history. All right, so the plan is in motion. The signal's been given. The 2 British columns are sailing right for the enemy, and the battle that will decide the fate of the seas is about to begin. At about noon on October 21st, 1805, the battle exploded. Just like Nelson planned, the British columns charged forward. The first ship to break through the enemy line was the Royal Sovereign. Then, about an hour later, Nelson's own famous flagship, the HMS Victory, did the exact same thing, smashing right into the center of the enemy fleet. And just like that, Nelson's huge gamble paid off. The nice, orderly enemy line completely fell apart. Suddenly, the battle wasn't a formation fight anymore. It was a messy, chaotic series of one-on-one ship duels. And this was exactly the kind of fight Nelson had wanted to create. I mean, just try to imagine what it was like. The air was so thick with gunpowder smoke, you could barely see. The noise from hundreds of cannons going off at once would have been absolutely deafening. Ships were literally getting tangled up with each other, with sailors firing muskets across the decks. It was just complete and total chaos. So Nelson's tactic was working better than anyone could have hoped. The British were winning, and winning big. But that victory was about to come at a terrible, personal price. Let this number sink in for a second. 0. That is the number of ships the British lost in the battle. In one of the biggest naval battles ever fought against a bigger fleet, they didn't lose a single ship. It was a stunning, almost unbelievable result. But that amazing victory came with a heavy cost. Nelson was on the main deck of his ship, directing the battle. He was wearing his full-dress uniform, which made him a really obvious target. A French sharpshooter high up in the rigging of a nearby ship took his shot. The bullet hit Nelson in the shoulder and went down into his spine. He was carried below deck, knowing the wound was fatal. Even as he was dying, all Nelson cared about was the battle. He kept asking for updates, and just before he died that afternoon, they were able to tell him that they had captured 17 enemy ships and won a complete victory. His job was done. So the battle was won, but the man who dreamed up the winning plan was gone. What was the real legacy of this one incredibly violent day at sea? Well, first, there was a crazy epilogue to the whole thing. As if the battle wasn't enough, right after it ended, a massive storm rolled in. For days, the completely exhausted crews had to fight the waves just to stay afloat. The storm was so bad that a lot of the damaged ships they had captured ended up sinking or getting wrecked on the coast. The long-term effects were just huge. First off, Napoleon's plan to invade Britain? It was over. Cancelled for good. With the French and Spanish navies crippled, the British Royal Navy had total control of the oceans for the next century. This period allowed Britain's global empire and trade to grow like never before. And you can still see Nelson's legacy all over Britain today. There's Trafalgar Square in London, named for the battle, with a giant statue of him right in the middle. And the coolest part? You can actually go and walk the decks of his flagship, HMS Victory. It's still there, preserved as a museum. So, the Battle of Trafalgar is this amazing story of a bold strategy and incredible skill winning against the odds. But you can't really separate the victory from the tragic death of the leader who made it all possible. It leaves us with this question that people still debate. When it comes to winning, what matters more, the brilliant plan or the leader who is willing to sacrifice everything to make it happen?